Many of the writers whom we've looked at in this course seem to have been programmed from birth to greatness. That's to say, if you think of Milton, it's almost as if, some fairy wished him literary greatness in his cradle. Other writers have come from nowhere, but I think no writer has been more unexpected in terms of literary greatness, that's to say, in terms of pedigree, than the author we're looking at today, Mary Shelley. In fact, I think people might even question that name and call her Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley. That gives an idea perhaps of where some of her greatness is coming from, the author we looked at before, who wrote The Vindication of the Rights of Woman. Anyway, her life is quite extraordinary, and the most extraordinary thing about it is that she wrote this book, Frankenstein. Now, I don't want to begin with Mary Shelley's life. I want to begin with the circumstances, the scene setting in which that work came into existence. But perhaps to put it another way, I want to pose a problem. If you are asked what was the most productive summer holiday in literary history, I think you'd have to opt for that which took place in July 1816 in a villa, a very luxurious villa, at Lake Geneva in Switzerland. The Napoleonic Wars, the longest conflict since the 100 Years' War with the same enemy, France, were at last over. Britons could travel freely again, and of course they were victorious, which meant they liked to travel over Europe since they conquered the place. Present on that Swiss vacation were Lord Byron, the man whom we looked at, who woke in March 1812 to find himself famous with the publication of Childe Harold. And he, at this point in 1816, was still bathed in the glamour of that poem and also surrounded by scandal. In fact, the scandal was probably greater than the glamour. The 18-year-old Mary Shelley was there with her partner, Percy Bysshe Shelley. He too was a great poet, like Byron, and he too was incredibly scandalous. He was a man who'd run away, leaving his family, his children, and his sexual partners behind him, leaving a wake of suicide and destitution in his wake. He did it all with great idealism, but the human damage he did was immense. Also there was a character who is not as well known to posterity, but nonetheless was very important on this occasion, Dr. John Polidori. And they were all there with their innamorati, the people they loved. It was a kind of commune as much as it was a literary event. And that love was of a particular kind. It was free love. Now, this was something that Mary Shelley did not go along with. She inherited from her mother and also from her father, William Godwin, a strong sense of morality. She didn't like necessarily the kind of, as it were, sort of communism, the sexual communism which was practiced there. Nor, it has to be said, did the English public like it. The nickname which was attached to these writers was the League of Incest. That's what British moralists call them. And that's because, of course, Byron had that very, very sensational relationship with his half-sister. Now, the literary outcome of that momentous holiday was the direct result of some miserable weather. It was so miserable, in fact, that none of these writers, these romantics, could leave the villa they'd taken, which was overlooking, as I say, one of the most magnificent views in Europe. They couldn't even see the lake in front of them. The weather was so rotten. Now, of course, they, in other circumstances, notionally, some of them quite liked bad weather. I mean, Shelley wrote a wonderful ode to the west wind. Let me read it to you. I'll give you an idea of the kind of poet he was. It is ultra-romantic. This is what he wrote about the west wind. O wild west wind, thou breath of autumn's being, thou from whose unseen presence the leaves dead are driven like ghosts from an enchanter fleeing, yellow and black and pale and hectic red, pestilence-stricken multitudes, that's the leaves. O thou who chariotest to their dark wintry bed, thou is the wind. O thou who chariotest to their dark wintry bed, the winged seeds where they lie cold and low, each like a corpse within its grave, until thine azure sister of the spring shall blow. It's wonderful stuff, though it's too rich for some tastes. Now, back to the actual weather, which in fact was very unlike what Shelley was writing about. History records 1816 as the year without a summer. Now, there's a geological reason for that. There'd been an eruption of a huge volcano, the Tambora volcano. 1816 is also known as the poverty year. Crops failed all over Europe. There was famine, there was violence. Switzerland was particularly badly affected. Now, you have to imagine this company. They'd gone on holiday and they couldn't have a holiday. And to relieve the boredom, they began to read Gothic novels. You remember Mrs. Radcliffe's fiction, that kind of thing. And restlessly creative themselves, I mean, they couldn't read something without wanting to write something better. They began to recite ghost stories to each other, ghost stories which they'd made up. And it was only a matter of time before they became competitive with each other. And these spine tinglers, you know, the nights were very long, the days were very dark, there were lots of candles about, it was a very atmospheric place. These spine tinglers, they thought it'd be fun to write them, and not only that, to compete with each other. So they set up this wonderful game as to which of them could come up with the most horrid and imaginative ghost story. So, you know, they were actually sort of rather overdoing it. But nonetheless, they were writing, they were exploring a genre. Now, of course, other writers, Coleridge, as we'll see, in The Ancient Mariner, also explored a genre, the same genre, the Gothic fiction genre, when he wrote the rhyme of The Ancient Mariner. But they, as I say, were doing it in a much more light-hearted spirit. Now, Mary Shelley was still a teenager, and she came up with Frankenstein, which would be published 2 years later in 1818. And there's no question, I think, that literary history has awarded her the outright winner's trophy in that writing competition. She has the gold medal, no question about it. It's an astonishing achievement. Now, Polidori, Dr. Polidori, possibly with the assistance of Byron, certainly inspired by the mad, bad lord whom he idolised, came up with The Vampire. Now, this was published in 1819, and it would be the direct inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula, which was published 80 years later. Percy's effort was not so wonderful. His head was always in the clouds and among the west winds. He wasn't as good as the others, but he did a fairly competent thing. But he did help revise, and he did, I think, have some input into Mary's story. Just how much is a matter of contention among feminists. But he was there, and his finger was in the pie, but he wasn't, in fact, manipulating it. So, to recap, to keep boredom at bay in summer 1816, two of the richest franchises in fiction were created, and neither, to Hollywood's eternal gratitude, neither of them was copyrighted or trademarked. Now, there have been some 200 Frankenstein or vampire movies since the 20th century broke, and more of them appear every year. Now, just imagine, what if the sun had been shining in 1816, as it should have been at that summery season of the year? What if the views had been magnificent? What if we'd had more poems like the Ode to the West Wind? What if excursions to the hills and boat trips were in order? And they had no time to write at all because they were having so much fun. Apart from, there might have been a few poems thrown off, perhaps a journal or so. Would there be blank spaces where all the Frankenstein and Dracula knockoffs, homages and rip-offs now lodge on our shelves and on our screens? It's a very nice conundrum, that. I mean, this kind of event has been so fertile. What would Anne Rice have done, the kind of dean of vampire writers, without a century and a half vampirology, all stemming from Polidori's Parlour Entertainment, which in its turn stemmed from this competition I was talking about. But in this lecture, I want to turn back now to Frankenstein, the young woman's wonderful creation. And it's as amazing in its way as the young scientist Victor Frankenstein's creation. Now, I want to see it clearly, if we can, to strip away all the filmic and pulp fiction heritage which is now encrusting it, to go back to the original, where it started, the idea at the heart of the franchise, Ray Kroc's first hamburger, if you want to put it in that way. Now, how did a girl, who I think in our system would be a 12th grader, come up with this masterpiece? Now, please forgive the word master, although one's use of it explains some of the surprise that one feels about her having written it. What was it Dr. Johnson said, that very offensive remark, that if you heard a woman preacher, what would surprise you was not what she was saying, but the fact she could do it because it would be like a dog walking on its hind legs. One doesn't expect it to be done. Now, Mary Shelley not only wrote a novel at a time of life and with a background which would make it very unlikely, highly unlikely, she wrote a work which is universally regarded as the best of its kind. And not only that, it's very, very original. Now, one explanation is genetic. Mary, as I implied earlier, was born to literary greatness. In a sense, she was born to it, though it didn't come automatically. Her full maiden name at birth was Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin. She was the daughter of the greatest living philosopher of his time, Godwin. Godwin is the architect of what we think of as liberalism. Some would have seen him at the time as an anarchist, as a free thinker. He was radical. Some would say almost revolutionary along the French philosophes like Rousseau. Now, Mary's mother was Mary Wollstonecraft, who was the author of A Vindication of the Rights of Woman, a work and a life which we looked at in an earlier lecture. Wollstonecraft, it's very tragic this, Wollstonecraft died a few days after Mary's birth in 1797. Now, 1797 was in other ways an ominous year. It was a period, as you'll recall, of revolution, national conflict and general upheaval in Europe. Maps were being redrawn. Societies were reorganizing. Now, Mary eloped with Shelley, much to William Godwin's disgust and rage, in 1814. At that point, she was aged just 16. Now, you can see it as divorce, Regency style, or you can see it as statutory rape, which is how I think how some modern lawmakers would see it. Now, the point is that Mary had imbibed high culture and advanced ideas, if not through her mother's milk, because her mother tragically died, but from her, as it were, her birth situation, from her milieu, as the French say. Shelley, who was physically beautiful, there's no more handsome writer, I think, in the 19th century. He was effortlessly creative. He was a genius. But he himself was also a radical. And it was an intellectual sympathy which had drawn him into the Godwin circle in the first place. So it was a marriage of minds in a sense, as well as being, as it were, a physical relationship. Poets, Shelley believed, were the unacknowledged legislators of mankind. They it was who had a direct line to the truth of things. They ought to be running the world. But of course, in no society have poets ever run the world. Now, the role of the poet has never been subject to higher claims than in Shelley's Neoplatonic defense of poetry. So you've got all these great ideas swirling around Mary. There's no reason why that should have made her a great writer, but to some extent they feed into the great writing that she did. She was surrounded from birth by the best minds, the finest sensibilities, and the most adventurous intellects of her time. You couldn't imagine a better education for a writer. She was not, in fact, formally educated. She breathed it in as others breathe in air. Now, despite all the debased adaptations that it's been subjected to, the original Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, let's call it, is, one should stress, a work of high culture. It's the kind of work which you can see Godwinian, Wollstonecraftian and Shelleyan sort of elements very clearly. The work's epigraph, in fact the full title is quite helpful here, Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. Prometheus, you remember, is the man who brought, not the man, the god who gave mankind fire and was punished for it. He was, if you like, the father of what we know as science. Now, Frankenstein's epigraph, that little poetic quotation on the title page, is from Milton's Paradise Lost. Did I request thee, maker, from my clay to mould me man? Did I solicit thee from darkness to promote me? Now, you remember from the Paradise Lost lecture that is Adam's complaint to his maker. I didn't ask to be made. Why did you make me? And if God is displeased with him for disobeying the divine ordinance and eating the apple, why did God make him in the first place? It's God's fault, not his, that the apple was eaten. So in this novel, in Mary Shelley's novel, the epigraph establishes from the title page on the literary company that Mary Shelley intends her work to keep. Milton, not Bram Stoker. But why, if you wanted to ponder such issues as human nature, did not Mary go the whole hog and write an epic like Milton's? Or a verse tragedy like Percy's Aeschylean verse tragedy, Prometheus Unbound, which is alluded to in her subtitle. Now, the reason, quite simply, is gender. Grand poetry, like high tragedy, was a male enclave. Women keep out was written over it. Now, we're well beyond here even Dr. Johnson's Walking Dogs. A woman simply could not presume to write tragedy or epic. Those were the two great Aristotelian genres that I talked about in the introduction. Comedy she might just manage, but not tragedy and not epic. And one looks in vain over the first 1,000 years of English literature for a female writer of epic verse or noble drama. And those who did try their hand, like Joanna Baillie, you've probably never heard of her, but those who did try, and her plays of the Passions were being put on the stage as Mary was writing. They were laughingstocks in their own day and virtually forgotten by posterity. People don't even write PhDs about them, they're so forgotten. The novel, though, was something else. Here, women had an entry pass. There was no sign saying no women over the novel. Partly because for a couple of hundred years, fiction was regarded as a low genre. No really respectable writer. Shelley would never write a novel. Byron would never write a novel. But women could get in there. So Mrs. Radcliffe, Fanny Burney, and above all Jane Austen, whose Emma came out the same year as Frankenstein, that these women had opened a gate for female genius. The novel is sometimes called the bourgeois or the domestic epic. You know, like the literal domestic arena, the home and its kitchen, it was a site in which women could express themselves, free of male oppression. And I sometimes think the novel is one of the great things that liberated women in the 19th century. There are other things, the typewriter, for instance, which men couldn't handle because they weren't dexterous enough, and various other things. But the novel, in fact, was one of the arenas in which women could actually be free. It was then logical for Mary to use fiction, as logical as the Spenserian stanza had been for Byron, or blank verse for Shelley, or the forceps for Dr. Polidori. This was something she could do. Now, the unusual circumstances of that 1816 vacation made it doubly inviting, inevitable almost, that she should actually write a novel. Now, let's now turn to the novel itself. The narrative of Shelley's horror story is very intricate, and she intuitively picked up a lot of the tricks of the trade from the German writers. She's very fast. Now, Frankenstein has an epistolary frame. It's written in letters, I beg your pardon, a novel in letters. And it begins with a brother, a mariner, a sailor, writing to his sister from St. Petersburg in Russia. This, I say, is a European novel, because I say Europe had just been opened up. Some time before the narrative begins to focus, the letters, in fact, are set up a little while before the actual sort of central events. And, of course, that central event is that extraordinary experiment which is going to be carried out in Victor Frankenstein's Geneva laboratory. Now, epistolary frames, as we'll see when we come to Wuthering Heights, have an effect of cooling a hot narrative. They diffuse it in ways so it's not as sensational as it might otherwise have been. And there's no hotter, no more heated up narrative than what Mary had in mind with Frankenstein. Now, the initial setting is literally cool. It opens in the frozen north on the ice floes, a scene reminiscent of Coleridge's Ancient Mariner, which also came out in 1816. A ship is surrounded, locked in pack ice, surrounded by icebergs. But what is that Captain Saville sees in the snowy distance? And this in fact is what he describes to his sister. I'll keep the quotation fairly short, but it is very dramatic. We perceived a low carriage fixed on a sledge and drawn by dogs pass on towards the north, at the distance of 1/2 a mile, a being which had the shape of a man, but apparently of gigantic stature, sat in the sledge and guided the dogs. We watched the rapid progress of the traveller with our telescopes until he was lost among the distant inequalities of the ice. I love that phrase, the distant inequalities of the ice. So this, in fact, is the first sight we have of the creature. And this strange, solitary giant is what Victor made in his laboratory. Now, a point, it is not, positively not a monster. Mary Shelley wasn't into that kind of horrifics, any more than Milton's Adam was a monster, or Eve, who's created from Adam's rib, is a monster. Now, the backstory emerges very, very gradually, and this is, of course, one of the tricks of horror fiction. You mustn't give too much away too early. You must keep your big effects for late on. It's very cunning narrative, crumb by crumb, increasing, not satisfying the appetite of the reader. Now, where did Mary learn this? It's a wonderful sort of skill that she has, but it's very hard to know where it's coming from. The story is convoluted, it's very twisted, but irresistibly gripping. There's a brilliant Swiss student, Victor Frankenstein. He becomes fascinated by electricity. Its galvanic power, run it through a dead body and the body twitches. It lives again. This was done, in fact, on a very amateur level all over the place. And people were amazed you could put an electric current through a frog and the frog's legs would start twitching. So as Prometheus gave mankind the double-edged gift of fire, so Victor will bestow on mankind the awesome power of the lightning bolt, electricity. It was seen at the time as a fluid. We still use the word current, which in fact suggests it's watery rather than kind of atmospheric. Now, electricity is the life-giving, the animating power in this novel. It's argued that among its other achievements, Frankenstein is the progenitor of modern science fiction. That's to say that man at last has in his hands, man or woman, a power to change the world, has in fact a technology. Now the story thereafter is well known alas, to millions who've never read Shelley's source text. It's folkloric. And I think it circulates in a sadly imperfect sense of what she originally did. You have to go back to the story to get the true, I think, sort of, as it were, brilliance of the original conception. Victor exhumes body parts from morgues, graves, and slaughterhouses. There are animal parts in the creature. And he put them together in what he calls my workshop of filthy creation. That's what he calls his laboratory, which is in an attic at the top of his house. Let me give the whole or not the whole part of that original sort of creation, his experiment, if you want to call it that. Who shall conceive the horrors of my secret toil as I dabbled among the unhallowed damps of the grave or tortured the living animal to animate the lifeless clay? I collected bones from charnel houses and disturbed with profane fingers the tremendous secrets of the human frame. Very powerful. And this is the event as it happens. It was on a dreary night of November that I beheld the accomplishment of my toils. With an anxiety that almost amounted to agony, I collected the instruments of life around me that I might infuse a spark of being into the lifeless thing that lay at my feet. It was already 1 a.m. A good thing. This is a very, very kind of dramatic time of the day or night. It was 1 a.m. And my candle was nearly burnt out when, by the glimmer of the half-extinguished light, I saw the dull yellow eye of the creature open. It breathed hard, and a convulsive motion agitated its limbs. How, she says, can I describe my emotions at this catastrophe? Or how delineate the wretch whom with such infinite pains and care I had endeavoured to form? His limbs were in proportion, and I had selected his features as beautiful. Beautiful! Great God! His yellow skin scarcely covered the work of muscles and arteries beneath. His hair was of a lustrous black and flowing, his teeth of a pearly whiteness. But these luxuriances only formed a more horrid contrast with his watery eyes that seemed almost of the same colour as the dun-white sockets in which they were set, his shriveled complexion and straight-back lips. He's a sight to make the blood run cold. And why in fact is that? Now, when God makes Adam, he finds him good. But why in fact when Victor makes his creature, why is he so disgusted, so appalled? Now, is it that he feels that he's committed some act of heresy, that he's gone against the Maker's ordinance, that man is not a creator but a creation? Unlikely. She wasn't a religious Puritan like John Bunyan. It can be allegorized in different ways, and some of those ways, in fact, are extremely far-fetched. One attractive hypothesis is that Mary Shelley, the political philosopher's daughter, the daughter of William Godwin, intends us to think of the French Revolution. Now, what was it Wordsworth wrote? when he was present at the beginning of the French Revolution. Bliss, wrote Wordsworth, was it to be alive when the revolution first broke, but to be young was very heaven. But 10 years later, with the Terror and then, of course, the subsequent war with England, that bliss had turned into something much, much more horrible. So is Mary Shelley, as it were, sort of allegorizing that, the idealism of the young revolutionary, which becomes disappointed? Now, by now, I think, by this point in the course, we're well aware that that a literary text is, a good literary text, a great literary text, is, as the critics say in their jargon, polyvalent. It has many meanings. It can carry many meanings simultaneously. That's in fact why we take so much trouble with it, why in fact we spend so much time with it, because it means so many interesting things simultaneously. And I don't think that the explanation that Mary Shelley is thinking of the French Revolution accounts for the visceral quality, the dun eyes, the yellow skin, and to some extent the kind of, the nausea which she feels. There's something else there, I think, something quite important. And to explain that, I think we have to go back, as I began, with certain facts in the relationship of the Shelleys, the biography. Now, sexual relations with Shelley began when Mary was very young, too young, I would say. Percy Bysshe Shelley was an adamant believer, as I say, in free love and sexual communism. Mary wasn't. She was a young girl. She was idealistic. She was a Bobby Soxer in some ways. Now, our sympathies may well be with her. Mine certainly are. Percy did huge damage, I mentioned that before, to women who were reckless enough to throw in their lot with him. By the time that she was writing Frankenstein, she's still 18, remember, she'd given birth twice. Mary had had 2 children. Out of the band, one of them out of the bands of wedlock. Her first child, Clara, died a few months after birth, plunging the mother into quite natural postnatal depression. And you have to recall that, as I mentioned, Mary's own birth had caused the death of her own mother. In fact, birth was surrounded for her with rather kind of horrible associations. The second child, William, had been born in January 1816. He was still crying in the background in that villa in Switzerland. But what kind of family was he born into, young William? The Shelleys, particularly the elopement with Mary, which was Shelley's second such elopement, were abominated by the respectable classes in England. They regarded them as human filth. Mary's own father, William Godwin, had disowned her. It's a terrible thing for a girl who idolised her father to find that he doesn't love her. So what the creation, so to call it, of Victor suggests or expresses, I would put to you, is postnatal depression. It's a common condition, and it's rendered, I think, in this occasion, more acute by the hideous instability of Mary Shelley's domestic circumstances. Victor is not he's a scientist, obviously. As I say, this novel means different things. He's a scientist, but he's not a father, although the creature likes to regard him as a father. He's a mother. He, in fact, has given birth. He hasn't created the monster, the creature. He's in fact, given it birth. And motherhood was, for Mary Shelley, a complex and painful thing. And that complexity is caught, I think, in the above strikingly effective moment in the novel, the genesis moment, the birth moment. And the creature horrifies. That in fact is the most horrific moment in the novel, in the narrative. Much more horrible than the murders which the monster goes on to create. Now, the monster thereafter has a very sad career. He in fact is the victim of circumstances. He's not criminal by nature. This was a very Godwinian thing. He's made criminal by the fact that he's thrown out of his own sort of domestic environment, the laboratory. His mother, his father, Victor. No one wants him, and so he goes on to commit crimes. This is a very Godwinian notion that this very, very liberal notion that criminals are not inherently evil. It is their life circumstances which drives them to crime. It's a very, very humane view. Mary Shelley introduces that very strongly into the novel. Now, as I began by saying that this is a novel if one can like any number of the adaptations of the variations of the Frankenstein scenario, which we've been subjected to, and some of them, I like a lot of them. I'm addicted to them in a sense. But nonetheless, if one goes back to Mary Shelley's original, one finds something very, very strange, very authentic, very, very unique. And I think that is something that we owe this author. She went on afterwards. She went on to write other novels. None of them is anywhere near as good as Frankenstein. It's one of the sadnesses, in fact, that her own circumstances disintegrated with the death of Shelley, who drowned on a lake in Italy, symbolically, and she found herself a solitary woman, and she never achieved again the creativity of that wonderful summer, which wasn't a summer, in July 1816.